The commotion that followed was, by the standards of a village garden party, remarkably restrained. Gregory Ashford did not shout or rush about in obvious panic. Instead, he excused himself from the magistrate's company with a murmured comment about an urgent matter requiring his immediate attention. Patricia, her composure visibly reassembled though her hands trembled slightly, began quietly requesting that guests might forgive them for a brief interruption to the festivities. Nothing was said explicitly, yet within moments the entire gathering had registered that something was profoundly wrong. It was Catherine who asked the question that hung unspoken on every lip. "Mother, what is it?" "What has happened?" Patricia exchanged a glance with her husband, a look that communicated volumes in the space of a heartbeat. Resignation, perhaps. Dismay, certainly. And underneath it all, something that might have been fear. "We cannot locate Margaret," Patricia said quietly. She appears to have left the manor. We cannot find her anywhere." The words seemed to hang in the warm afternoon air like a disruption in the natural order of things. Margaret Crane, a guest of 3 weeks' standing, had simply vanished from within the confines of Thornfield Manor during the space of a garden party. It was the sort of thing that did not happen in villages like St. Clement's, where propriety and predictability were considered cardinal virtues. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with her characteristic attention to detail. Richard Pembroke looked momentarily confused, as though trying to calculate the social implications of the situation. The vicar began making soothing noises about the possibility that Miss Crane had perhaps taken a walk in the gardens and lost track of time. Susan Hartley's eyes had widened with the thrill that only the young can experience when ordinary life suddenly becomes dramatic. Victor Hollis, standing near the refreshment table, had gone quite still. His weathered face had assumed an expression of careful neutrality, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers had tightened around the edge of the table, leaving small crescents in the linen cloth. "I'm certain there is a perfectly reasonable explanation," Gregory announced, addressing the assembled company with the forced cheerfulness of a man attempting to contain a situation. "Margaret is rather unpredictable. She may have decided to take a walk into the village without informing anyone. You know how these artistic types can be." He delivered the statement as though it were established fact rather than speculation, as though by declaring it so, he might make it true. But it wasn't true, Miss Marple thought. And Gregory Ashford knew it was not true. The rigidity of his jaw, the slight hesitation before he had offered his explanation, these betrayed a man constructing a narrative rather than reporting one. Patricia suggested, with careful politeness, that perhaps the guests might retire to the drawing room for refreshments while they sorted out the minor confusion. The suggestion was transparent. She was attempting to move people away from the terrace, away from whatever discovery might be imminent. But by then, suspicion had already taken root. The garden party, which had been such an ordered and pleasant affair mere minutes before, had transformed into something else entirely. The air itself seemed to have thickened with uncertainty. Miss Marple gathered her knitting deliberately and slowly, taking her time with the needles and yarn, watching as the other guests began their reluctant migration indoors. Only Victor Hollis remained motionless for a moment longer, staring toward the gardens with an expression of such profound distress that it seemed almost to physically diminish him. Then he, too, began moving, though his steps were mechanical, as though his body had ceased to receive clear instructions from his mind. By 4:30, the police constable from the village had been telephoned. By 5 o'clock, Inspector Carmichael from the county force had arrived, a competent-looking man of middle years whose expression suggested he had encountered enough human folly to be perpetually unsurprised by fresh evidence of it. By 5:30, he had confirmed what Gregory Ashford's careful narrative had been attempting to obscure. Margaret Crane was not anywhere within or immediately around Thornfield Manor. She had, as far as anyone could determine, simply ceased to exist from the moment she had walked through the drawing-room doors and disappeared from the sight of the assembled company. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow, observing as Inspector Carmichael conducted his preliminary interviews. He took statements with methodical efficiency. When had everyone last seen Miss Crane? Had she seemed distressed? Had anyone heard anything unusual? His questions were sensible ones, the questions a practical man would ask when faced with an unexplained absence. But Miss Marple had observed something that Inspector Carmichael, occupied as he was with procedures and protocols, had not yet noticed. She had watched Victor Hollis's face when Patricia had first mentioned Margaret's disappearance. She had seen the moment of shock transform into something else, not quite relief, but perhaps the terrible cessation of hope, as though he had been bracing for exactly this news, and now that it had arrived, some inner tension had released. And she had noticed, too, the way Gregory Ashford's eyes kept returning to the clock on the mantelpiece, as though calculating something, measuring something against time itself. By 6 o'clock, as the light outside began its slow shift from gold to amber, the garden party had been entirely abandoned. The remains of tea lay scattered across tables like the artifacts of a vanished civilization. And in the gathering dusk, the first hints of what would become a most peculiar and troubling mystery began to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind. Inspector Carmichael proved to be a thorough man, if not an imaginative one. He had established himself in Gregory Ashford's study by 7 o'clock, converting that comfortable room of leather and mahogany into something resembling an interrogation chamber. The drawing-room had been designated as a waiting area, where the guests and household staff were required to remain until they had been questioned. It was an arrangement that produced precisely the sort of tension and irritation that Inspector Carmichael apparently considered conducive to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. Miss Marple observed that tension with her characteristic detachment. She had positioned herself in a corner of the drawing-room, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting, though her attention was directed entirely toward the interactions occurring around her. It was remarkable, she had often reflected, how much people revealed about themselves when they were uncomfortable and frightened. Discomfort stripped away the careful layers of social convention, leaving only the raw facts of temperament and conscience. Catherine Ashford sat rigidly on one of the damask settees, her engagement ring catching the light with each small, nervous gesture of her hand. Richard Pembroke stood beside her, with the air of a man who wished to appear supportive but had no clear notion of how to accomplish this. They spoke in low tones, fragments of their conversation reaching Miss Marple's ears. Simply cannot understand. And perfectly respectable woman, or so one thought. And whatever could have possessed her to simply leave? Patricia Ashford had occupied an armchair near the window, her face maintaining the carefully controlled expression of a woman who had spent decades managing crises through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge their full reality. She had requested tea at 6:30 and taken 2 sips before setting the cup aside untouched. Her fingers worked continuously at the handkerchief in her lap, pleating and repleating the fabric as though it were a problem that might be solved through sufficient manipulation. It was Victor Hollis, however, who drew Miss Marple's most sustained attention. The estate manager had positioned himself as far from the other guests as the room's configuration would permit, standing near the bookshelves with the posture of a man enduring a sentence rather than passing time. His eyes moved repeatedly toward the door through which Inspector Carmichael conducted his interviews, and his jaw worked continuously, as though grinding through some internal calculation. Twice Miss Marple observed him make as if to speak to someone, then think better of it, subsiding back into silence. At 7:45, a constable arrived with news that appeared to animate the inspector considerably. There was a brief consultation in the study, conducted in tones too low for Miss Marple to discern the content, though the constable's expression suggested the discovery was not insignificant. 10 minutes later, Inspector Carmichael emerged, and requested that Victor Hollis present himself for questioning. The effect was remarkable. Victor's entire frame seemed to tighten, as though every muscle had contracted simultaneously. He set down the book he had been holding without appearing to have registered that he was holding it. For a moment, he simply stood motionless. Then, with the gait of a man approaching the gallows rather than a police interrogation, he followed the inspector into the study. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her mind was working rapidly through the implications of what she had just observed. The inspector's summons had not surprised Victor Hollis. Indeed, if Miss Marple read the situation correctly, he had been expecting it, had perhaps been bracing himself for it from the moment Patricia Ashford had announced Margaret's disappearance. Susan Hartley, the vicar's niece, could bear the tension no longer. "This is absolutely dreadful," she announced to no one in particular. "A woman simply vanishes from a garden party, and we are all to sit here as though nothing has happened. It is like something from a novel, except that novels are never quite this uncomfortable." "In novels," Miss Marple observed mildly, not looking up from her knitting, "matters are usually resolved rather more expeditiously than in real life. The truth, I have found, prefers to take its time revealing itself." "But where can she have gone?" Susan pressed. "The manor is surrounded by gardens and then the village beyond. Surely someone would have seen her leaving." "That," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "depends rather upon whether anyone was looking." Patricia Ashford's head came up sharply at that remark, though she said nothing. But Miss Marple observed the calculation that flickered across her face. A reassessment of something, a reconsideration of facts already known but perhaps not yet properly understood. It was Richard Pembroke, the solicitor, who voiced the question that had presumably been occupying all their minds. "Do you suppose she has met with some accident? Could she have fallen somewhere?" "In a house." Gregory Ashford's voice emerged from somewhere in the hallway, preceding him into the drawing room. He appeared agitated in a way that his earlier composure had not entirely masked. "One does not simply fall and disappear from a house during a garden party." "One does not simply disappear at all," Miss Marple said quietly. "And yet disappear she has. Which means, of course, that whatever has occurred, it was deliberate. The question is simply, whose deliberation?" The room fell silent at that. It was a silence pregnant with implications, the silence of people confronting a truth they had been attempting to avoid. Margaret Crane had not wandered away unthinking. She had not taken a walk and lost herself. She had, by the logic of Miss Marple's observation, been made to disappear by someone with motive and means. At 8:15, Victor Hollis emerged from the study. His face had become, if possible, even grayer than before. He was escorted directly back to the study by a constable, this time accompanied by a second police officer who had arrived while he was being questioned. As he passed through the drawing room, his eyes found Patricia Ashford's face for just a moment. There was something in that glance, a question perhaps, or a plea for understanding before he was led away. Miss Marple set down her knitting and picked up her cold tea, regarding the cup with the contemplative expression of someone considering far more than the simple fact of its temperature. The mystery of Margaret Crane's disappearance was beginning to acquire shape and substance, though the true outlines remained obscured. But they would emerge. Miss Marple was certain. They always did. One simply had to observe carefully and wait for human nature to reveal its customary patterns of weakness and desire. The evening had deepened into full night by the time Inspector Carmichael assembled the remaining guests in the drawing room for what he termed a preliminary summary of facts. The electric lights had been switched on, casting the room into that particular brightness that seemed to drain all color from human faces and render everyone slightly unreal. Miss Marple observed that the assembled company had acquired the haunted aspect of people who had passed through some ordeal and emerged changed by the experience. Inspector Carmichael stood before the fireplace with the posture of a man accustomed to delivering judgments. His subordinate stood near the door, notebook in hand, recording whatever pronouncements were to follow. The inspector's expression suggested that he had reached certain conclusions and considered them sufficiently substantial to warrant sharing with those assembled. "Miss Margaret Crane," he began, his voice carrying the flat certainty of official authority, "was last observed by multiple witnesses at approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon." She excused herself from the terrace gathering and entered the manor through the drawing-room doors. She was not observed departing through those same doors, or indeed through any other exit from the house. At approximately 4:20, Mrs. Patricia Ashford discovered that Miss Crane was not in any of the public rooms of the manor. A search of the private rooms in the garden grounds revealed no trace of her. "But surely," Richard Pembroke interjected, "she might have simply departed in a manner none of us witnessed. A back exit, perhaps." "All exits have been accounted for," the inspector replied with a flatness that suggested he found the question tedious. "The constables have examined every door and window. None show signs of forced egress. The household staff, questioned separately, can account for their whereabouts during the relevant period. It is my preliminary assessment that Miss Crane has not left Thornfield Manor." The statement produced a reaction that might have been amusing under different circumstances. Catherine gasped. Susan Hartley's hand flew to her mouth. Richard Pembroke's face acquired a slightly green tinge. Even Patricia Ashford's careful composure faltered for an instant. "Not left?" Gregory Ashford's voice emerged somewhat strained. "But if she has not left, then where?" "That," said Inspector Carmichael, "is precisely the question to which I require answers. During the course of my preliminary interviews, a rather significant fact has emerged. Miss Margaret Crane was not simply a social guest at Thornfield Manor. She was, it appears, an individual with whom certain members of this household had previous associations." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. She had been waiting for this revelation, had suspected its general shape, though not its specific content. The inspector had apparently extracted from Victor Hollis some admission that went beyond mere coincidence or casual acquaintance. "Victor Hollis," the inspector continued, his tone now acquiring a note of accusation, "has admitted to knowing Miss Crane prior to her arrival at the manor 3 weeks ago. Moreover, he has admitted to a romantic entanglement with her that predates her residence here. The estate manager has further admitted that he met with Miss Crane, at her request, on the evening prior to the garden party, at which time she indicated that she possessed information of a sensitive nature regarding certain household matters." Gregory Ashford's face had gone quite white. Patricia's fingers had stilled in their continuous pleating of her handkerchief. Catherine looked from her father to her mother with an expression of dawning comprehension, though whether her understanding was accurate or merely a projection of fear remained unclear. "I must emphasize," the inspector said, "that at present Miss Crane's disappearance must be considered a missing person inquiry. However, the peculiar circumstances, a woman vanishing from a locked house, the apparent deliberation of her concealment, suggest that this matter may evolve in a more serious direction. I shall be establishing a more permanent investigative presence at the manor. No one is to leave the premises without explicit permission." The announcement was met with the sort of stunned silence that typically accompanied the imposition of restrictions. Miss Marple observed that the psychological effect was precisely as the inspector presumably intended. The declaration that they were not to leave transformed the drawing room from a place where concerned citizens waited to a place where suspects were held. After the inspector had dismissed them to their rooms, with constables stationed discreetly throughout the manor, the household gradually dispersed into the corridors and chambers of Thornfield. Miss Marple, having been offered a guest room by Patricia, with a politeness that barely masked her anxiety, made her way upstairs at a measured pace. But rather than retiring immediately, she made use of the walk to observe. The manor, examined in the aftermath of official investigation, revealed certain details that the afternoon's garden party had obscured. There were servants moving about with the suppressed excitement that crises always produced in domestic staff. There was the smell of pipe smoke emerging from beneath the study door where Gregory Ashford had apparently taken refuge. And there was, most significantly, the peculiar configuration of the ground floor rooms that suggested multiple means of communication between spaces that ostensibly required passage through doors. It was as Miss Marple was ascending the main staircase that she encountered Patricia Ashford in the hallway. The mistress of the manor appeared haggard, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that suggested she was calculating whether the elderly woman might be made a confidant. "This is quite dreadful," Patricia said, the statement hanging in the corridor like an inadequate prayer. "I cannot imagine what Gregory was thinking, allowing her to remain here. I tried to insist she leave, but he would not hear of it. He said it would cause talk, that it would seem inhospitable. And now—" She trailed off, apparently unable or unwilling to complete the thought. But Miss Marple observed that beneath her distress, Patricia was calculating something, reassessing the information now in the public domain and determining how it altered her understanding of the situation. "Human nature," Miss Marple observed gently, "is remarkably consistent in its expressions of self-protection. People rarely act in ways that are entirely senseless, though their sense may not be immediately apparent to observers." Patricia looked at her oddly, as though trying to determine whether the old woman had meant something significant by her remark. Then, with a murmured "good night," she turned and walked toward the master bedroom, leaving Miss Marple alone in the corridor. Miss Marple continued to her guest room with the unhurried steps of someone who understood that the most important revelations were rarely immediate. They accumulated gradually, one small observation attaching itself to another until a pattern emerged from what had seemed like random disconnection. And somewhere within Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple was increasingly certain that pattern was already visible to anyone willing to look carefully enough. The night at Thornfield Manor acquired the quality of a held breath, the sort of oppressive stillness that settles over a house when normal routines have been disrupted by extraordinary events. Miss Marple lay in the guest bed, ostensibly at rest, but in fact engaged in the quiet work of mental organization. She had lived long enough to understand that the solution to any human puzzle lay not in dramatic revelation, but in the careful accumulation and arrangement of observed facts. She had observed, for instance, that Gregory Ashford's admission of Margaret Crane's presence had been somewhat incomplete. Inspector Carmichael had focused his questioning on Victor Hollis's connection to the missing woman, but Miss Marple had noted the careful way Gregory had responded to certain questions, the slight hesitations, the emphasis on facts that seemed designed to deflect rather than illuminate. There was something about Margaret Crane's arrival at the manor that Gregory Ashford had not fully disclosed. At midnight, unable to sleep and seeing no reason to pretend otherwise, Miss Marple rose and dressed with deliberate care. She had learned that late-night hours often provided opportunities for observation that daylight rendered impossible. People, made restless by anxiety and insomnia, were prone to nocturnal wanderings that revealed their preoccupations far more truthfully than any formal interview. The manor's corridors were illuminated by strategically placed gas lamps, casting pools of light separated by stretches of shadow. Miss Marple made her way downstairs with the careful steps of someone who had navigated unfamiliar territory in the darkness many times before. She was not surprised to discover that she was not the only insomniac resident of Thornfield. In the study, visible through a partially open door, Gregory Ashford sat at his desk with a glass of what appeared to be whiskey at his elbow. Before him lay several documents, letters, it appeared, their pages yellowed with age. He was reading them with the concentrated intensity of a man attempting to extract meaning from words that had presumably been troubling him for some time. His face, illuminated by the desk lamp, bore an expression of profound distress. Miss Marple did not approach. Instead, She continued past the study toward the library, which was her ostensible destination should she encounter anyone who questioned her nocturnal movements. It was as she passed the drawing room that she heard the sound, a soft, almost cautious movement from within the darkened space. She paused, allowing her eyes to adjust to the deeper shadows. There, near the window that overlooked the gardens, a figure stood motionless. It was Patricia Ashford, dressed in her nightgown and wrapper, staring out into the darkness with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something far more distant than the night-shrouded grounds. Miss Marple observed the other woman for a long moment without announcing her presence. It was a tactic she had employed many times over the decades. The simple act of unobserved observation often revealed far more than any direct inquiry. What she saw was a woman wrestling with something internal, her hands clenched at her sides, her body rigid with tension. "You cannot sleep either," Patricia said suddenly, without turning from the window. "I wondered if anyone else had been disturbed by this dreadful business." "The mind," Miss Marple replied gently, "has a tendency to work through troubles that the body would prefer to rest. One finds oneself turning events over repeatedly, searching for some element one has missed." "Have you?" Patricia turned then, regarding Miss Marple with an expression that seemed to contain both hope and dread. "Have you missed something that would explain this?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the explanation lies less in what has been missed and more in what has been deliberately obscured. Disappearances, I have found, rarely occur without substantial preparation." Patricia's face went very still. She turned back to the window, and when she spoke again, her voice had acquired a hollow quality. "Margaret was not simply a guest, was she? You know that already, of course. Everyone will know it soon enough." "I believe," Miss Marple said, moving to stand beside the other woman, "that Miss Crane's connection to this household was more complex than the simple romantic entanglement with Mr. Hollis. Inspector Carmichael has focused on that fact because it is the most obvious one. But the most obvious facts are often the least significant ones." Patricia's hands trembled visibly. "You are a perceptive woman, Miss Marple. I've observed that about you during our various parish encounters. That is, I suspect, why Gregory invited you this afternoon. He wished for there to be a witness he could trust to observe matters fairly." "Did he?" Miss Marple regarded the other woman with genuine interest. This was a detail she had not previously considered, though now that it was raised, she recognized its significance. Gregory Ashford had not invited her randomly. He had, it appeared, anticipated that something might occur that would require the presence of a trusted observer. Then, Mr. Ashford was aware that Miss Crane's presence might lead to some sort of crisis? "Not precisely," Patricia said slowly. "He was aware that her presence was already creating tensions that might culminate in something unpleasant. But I do not think he anticipated this. I do not think anyone could have anticipated this." Before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, a sound echoed through the manor, a constable's whistle, sharp and urgent, followed by raised voices. Both women turned sharply toward the hallway. There were footsteps moving rapidly through the corridors, shouts that seemed to emanate from the basement level of the house. Patricia's face went ashen. "No," she whispered. "Oh God, no." They made their way quickly to the main hallway, where other household members were emerging in various states of undress. Inspector Carmichael appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his expression confirming what Miss Marple had already suspected. "We have found her," the inspector announced, grimly. "Miss Margaret Crane, in the wine cellar. She has been deceased for approximately 6 to 8 hours. The statement produced the sort of chaos that typically followed such announcements: exclamations, questions, expressions of shock and horror. But Miss Marple, observing the assembly with her characteristic attention, noticed something that the others had missed. Gregory Ashford, emerging from the study, did not look surprised. He looked rather as though a burden he had been carrying had suddenly shifted, transformed from uncertainty into terrible, definable reality. and Patricia Ashford, standing beside Miss Marple, closed her eyes as though she had been bracing for precisely this news, and now that it had arrived, some inner tension had released. The discovery of Margaret Crane's body transformed Thornfield Manor from a house of mystery into something far more sinister. A crime scene, a place where someone had committed murder and then maintained the fiction of normalcy, while the corpse lay undiscovered in the darkened wine cellar. Inspector Carmichael's preliminary inquiry metamorphosed into a formal homicide investigation, and with it came additional police resources, a police surgeon, and the methodical apparatus of official murder investigation. Miss Marple found herself relegated to the drawing room along with the other guests and household members, though her status as an elderly woman of obvious respectability seemed to grant her certain latitude that the others did not possess. The constables treated her with a deference that suggested they had been instructed to afford her particular consideration. She suspected that Gregory Ashford, or perhaps Patricia, had mentioned to Inspector Carmichael that she was not merely a guest, but a woman of some standing within the village community. It was nearly dawn when the police surgeon completed his preliminary examination and offered his initial assessment. Margaret Crane had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted with some heavy object that had not been recovered. The timing suggested she had been killed shortly after disappearing from the garden party, probably between 4 o'clock and 4:30 in the afternoon. Death would have been relatively instantaneous, which the inspector apparently considered a point worth emphasizing, as though merciful murder was somehow less culpable than prolonged suffering. The question, Inspector Carmichael announced to the assembled household and guests at approximately 6 o'clock, is how the perpetrator managed to inflict fatal injuries within the manor without witnesses, and how they subsequently transported the body to the wine cellar without being observed. It was a logical question, though Miss Marple recognized that it was also somewhat misleading. It assumed that the killer had faced any significant obstacle in accomplishing these tasks. In reality, she suspected, the logistics of the murder had been considerably simpler than the inspector's phrasing suggested. "The wine cellar," continued the inspector, "is accessed through a door in the kitchen corridor. That door was, according to the household staff, locked at the time of the crime. The key was in the possession of Mr. Gregory Ashford, as it always is, yet the body was nonetheless deposited there. This suggests either that the key was obtained from Mr. Ashford, or that the cellar was accessed through some alternative means." Gregory Ashford's face had acquired a peculiar shade of gray. "I have made no mention of my keys to anyone," he said, his voice somewhat strangled. "And I have examined my key ring this morning. The cellar key remains where it has always been." "Which brings us," the inspector said, turning his full attention upon Gregory, "to the alternative possibility, that the killer possessed prior knowledge of an alternative means of access to the wine cellar, perhaps a secondary entrance, or perhaps a means of access that does not require a key at all." Catherine made a small sound of distress. Richard placed a protective hand on her shoulder, though his own face suggested considerable anxiety. Patricia remained motionless, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested she was expending considerable effort in maintaining that composure. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple raised her hand with the diffidence of someone seeking permission to speak. Inspector Carmichael, apparently recognizing her status, acknowledged her with a nod. "I've observed," Miss Marple said quietly, "that many older houses of this vintage possessed certain unconventional architectural features. Passages sometimes that connected different portions of the building for purposes of domestic convenience or, in some cases, for reasons of a more historical nature. I wondered whether Thornfield Manor, given its age, might possess such features." The suggestion produced a subtle but perceptible shift in the assembly's demeanor. Inspector Carmichael regarded her with new interest. Gregory Ashford's hand moved to his collar as though the room had suddenly become uncomfortably warm. "An astute observation," Patricia said quietly. She seemed, having once begun to acknowledge certain realities, to be continuing in that direction. Thornfield does possess such passages. There is a servant's passage that connects the kitchen to the wine cellar, used historically for the delivery of provisions without disturbing the main household. The door is concealed behind the pantry shelving. And, Miss Marple continued, turning her attention to Patricia with the gentle persistence of someone following a logical line of inquiry, that door would presumably be known to anyone with extensive knowledge of the household. The estate manager, for instance. Victor Hollis, who had been brought downstairs under custody following the discovery of the body, made a sound that might have been a protest or an acknowledgement. Constable placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "I showed her," Victor said, his voice barely audible. "Margaret asked about the history of the house. She was interested in the architecture. I explained the passage system to her, but that was 3 weeks ago when she first arrived. I did not think, I could not have imagined, that she would use that knowledge to conceal her own body." Inspector Carmichael's tone suggested that he found this defense inadequate at best, or that you would use it to dispose of her after committing murder. "I did not kill her," Victor said, and there was in his voice a quality of such profound desperation that even Inspector Carmichael seemed to pause in his interrogation. "I loved her, whatever she had done, whatever she was. I did not kill her." The declaration hung in the morning air like an indictment of everyone present, because, Miss Marple reflected, it raised the question that had presumably been occupying Inspector Carmichael's mind since the body's discovery. If not Victor Hollis, who? The obvious suspect was becoming less obvious as additional facts emerged. It was Gregory Ashford who spoke next, his voice containing a note of resignation. "Margaret Crane," he said slowly, "was not simply the cousin of my wife that we presented her to be. She was, in fact, the daughter of a man with whom I had certain business dealings many years ago. Dealings that did not conclude to anyone's satisfaction. She arrived at my door 3 weeks ago, claiming that she had discovered certain documents relating to those dealings. Documents that suggested I had engaged in actions that were, at the very least, ethically questionable. You are suggesting, Inspector Carmichael said carefully, that Miss Crane was attempting to blackmail you. I am suggesting, Gregory replied, that she was attempting to ascertain whether I would pay to prevent certain information from becoming public knowledge. I refused. I told her she was welcome to do as she saw fit with whatever documents she believed she possessed, and I informed my wife of the matter so that there would be no appearance of impropriety in how I had handled her demands. Miss Marple observed that Patricia's expression had not altered significantly at this revelation. She had, apparently, already known this information. What she had not known, Miss Marple suspected, was what Gregory had done after his refusal to accede to Margaret's implicit demands. That, the inspector said slowly, is precisely the sort of motive that typically results in murder. A man protecting his reputation from exposure. Yes, Gregory agreed quietly. It is. Which is why I did not kill her. The morning progressed with the methodical accumulation of small, damning details that seemed to point simultaneously in multiple directions without settling definitively upon any single suspect. Inspector Carmichael conducted separate interviews with each member of the household, a process that consumed several hours and produced a mounting sense of tension that permeated every room of Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple observed that the psychological effect of sustained interrogation was becoming apparent in the faces and behaviors of those involved. Catherine had begun to exhibit signs of genuine distress that transcended mere social embarrassment. Richard attempted repeatedly to comfort her, though his own anxiety was scarcely less visible. The servants moved about their duties with the subdued efficiency of people desperate to appear uninvolved in the unfolding tragedy. It was near midday when Inspector Carmichael requested Miss Marple's presence in the study for what he termed a consultation on certain observations. She rose without apparent reluctance, though she understood perfectly that what the inspector was actually seeking was her assessment of the household dynamics and her understanding of the various lies and evasions he had encountered during his interviews. "You have been quiet throughout this affair," the inspector observed, gesturing for Miss Marple to occupy a chair across from his makeshift desk. "I wonder if that quietness reflects a lack of observations or merely a preference for discretion." "Both, perhaps," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "I've observed a great deal, Inspector. Whether my observations are relevant to your investigation is another matter entirely." "Try me," he said, and there was in his tone a note of genuine interest. "You are clearly a woman of considerable perception. What is your assessment of this situation?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap with deliberate care. She had anticipated this conversation and had given considerable thought to how much information she ought to share with official authorities who, while competent, sometimes lacked the subtle understanding of human motivation that came from decades of parish observation. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the apparent complexity of this case masks a fundamentally straightforward situation. There is an obvious suspect, Mr. Hollis, who has motive, opportunity, and prior knowledge of the means. Yet you appear to doubt his guilt. That doubt, I suspect, stems from your observation that his emotional response to Miss Crane's death does not align with the behavior one would expect from her murderer." "Precisely," the inspector agreed, leaning back in his chair. "His distress appears genuine. A man committing murder out of passion rarely maintains such emotional coherence immediately afterward. Yet his connection to the victim, combined with his knowledge of the servant's passage, places him directly in the frame." "Which suggests," Miss Marple continued, "that someone deliberately arranged matters to make his guilt appear probable. The question is, who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to do so?" "The household," the inspector said heavily. "One of the Ashfords, or perhaps one of the senior servants. But the timeline is difficult. Margaret Crane disappeared between 4 and 4:30. During that period, Gregory was on the terrace with approximately 20 witnesses. Patricia was also present, though she left the terrace briefly. The servants were occupied with refreshments. Catherine and Richard were together. Where is the opportunity?" "You are assuming," Miss Marple observed, "that the opportunity lay in the moment between 4 and 4:30 when Miss Crane disappeared from observation. But what if the critical moment occurred earlier? What if Miss Crane was not killed when she disappeared, but rather at some point before the garden party began?" The inspector's expression shifted noticeably. "That is impossible. Multiple guests saw her alive and speaking during the afternoon." "Did they?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or did they see someone who appeared to be Miss Crane? A woman in her clothing, perhaps, engaged in superficial social interaction that required no extended conversation. Human perception is remarkably unreliable when one is not specifically attending to detail." Inspector Carmichael rose and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the implications of this possibility. "You are suggesting that a substitute was present during the garden party, while the real Margaret Crane was already dead." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that you might examine the nature of the interactions that occurred during the garden party rather more carefully. Did anyone engage in extended conversation with Miss Crane? Or did all interactions remain superficial? Did she consume food or beverages? Did she move naturally, or did her movements possess a certain rigidity?" "My God," the inspector murmured. "If the body in the wine cellar has been there since before the garden party, then the timeline I have constructed is entirely incorrect. That opens possibilities I had not considered." It was at precisely that moment that a constable entered with news that appeared to agitate the inspector considerably. There was a brief, urgent consultation conducted in low tones. Then the inspector excused himself from the study, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She did not remain alone for long. Patricia Ashford appeared in the study doorway within moments, her carefully maintained composure finally fracturing entirely. She closed the door behind her with deliberate care and seated herself across from Miss Marple with the air of a woman who had reached the limit of her endurance. "It was Catherine," Patricia said without preamble. Her voice was steady but contained the sort of emotional devastation that came from acknowledging a truth one had been attempting to deny. Not intentionally, of course. It was an accident. Margaret came to the house early in the afternoon, before the garden party officially began. She had something she wished to discuss with Gregory, more demands, more threats. Catherine encountered her in the hallway. They quarreled. Margaret said things about Gregory, about the business dealings, things that Catherine did not understand, but recognized as deeply damaging. They struggled. Margaret fell. Her head struck the edge of the marble table in the hallway. "And then?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Catherine panicked. She went directly to Gregory and told him what had occurred. He did what he thought was necessary to protect her. He moved the body to the wine cellar through the servants' passage. Then he sent Catherine to her room to compose herself and instructed Victor to remain visible during the garden party, while making certain the substitute, one of the housemaids who bears a passing resemblance to Margaret, was positioned where she would be observed. "A housemaid," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "That would explain the rigidity of movement you observed, the lack of extended conversation, and Gregory's careful invitation to ensure I would be present to observe the events objectively." "He believed," Patricia said, "that if a person of your reputation witnessed the garden party and its aftermath, you would be able to attest to the apparent normalcy of the afternoon. It would provide cover for the deception. But he did not count on murder occurring," Miss Marple observed. "He anticipated merely that questions might arise about Margaret's departure." "No," Patricia agreed. "He could not have anticipated that Inspector Carmichael would discover the body so quickly, or that you would perceive the substitution." Miss Marple regarded the other woman with an expression of profound sadness. "And now?" she asked. "What happens now?" "Now," Patricia said quietly, "we face the consequences of love and the terrible decisions it compels us to make." Miss Marple sat in silence for several moments following Patricia's confession, her mind working through the moral and practical implications of what she had just been told. The case, which had appeared to grow increasingly complex, had suddenly resolved itself into something far simpler and yet far more tragic. A young woman's panic, a father's protective instinct, a mother's desperate attempt to shield her family from consequences. These were the elements that had constructed the elaborate deception. "You understand," Miss Marple said finally, "that I cannot remain silent about this information. Inspector Carmichael is conducting a murder investigation. Withholding evidence would make me complicit in obstructing justice." "I know," Patricia replied, and there was in her voice a quality of resignation that suggested she had anticipated precisely this response. "I am not asking you to remain silent. I am attempting to explain the circumstances so that you might understand what has driven my family to such desperate measures. Understanding does not require condoning, but it does require acknowledging the human complexity beneath the actions." "That is true," Miss Marple acknowledged. "And I do understand. I've lived long enough to recognize that people rarely commit evil acts from malice alone. Usually, they stem from fear, from love, from the desire to protect those we value. Yet understanding does not change the fundamental reality that a young woman is dead, and that your family has chosen to obscure that death rather than face it honestly." "Catherine did not murder her," Patricia said, her voice acquiring an edge of desperation. "It was an accident, a tragic, terrible accident, but it was an accident." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but accidents have consequences regardless of their nature. And the concealment of accidents is itself a form of crime, one that compounds the initial tragedy with additional layers of deception." Before Patricia could respond, there came a sharp knock upon the study door. Inspector Carmichael entered without awaiting permission, his expression indicating that whatever news he carried was of considerable significance. Behind him came a constable escorting the housemaid who had served as substitute for Margaret Crane during the garden party. The young woman appeared terrified, her face pale and her hands trembling visibly. "I believe," the inspector said, his tone suggesting he had reached important conclusions, "that we have resolved certain discrepancies in the timeline. This young woman, Miss Ellen Hartwell, has admitted to participating in a deception orchestrated by Mr. Gregory Ashford. She was positioned during the garden party to be observed in the place where guests expected Miss Margaret Crane to be located. She wore clothing similar to Miss Crane's and maintained a distant position that discouraged close observation." Patricia's face had gone absolutely white. She seemed to be bracing herself for what she knew was about to follow. "Furthermore," the inspector continued, "Miss Hartwell has provided information that suggests the body discovered in the wine cellar may have been deceased for a considerably longer period than my initial assessment. The household staff has confirmed that the servants' passage was accessed at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, several hours before Miss Crane's supposed disappearance from the garden party." "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "I believe Mrs. Ashford has information that would assist your investigation considerably. She has agreed to provide a statement regarding the actual sequence of events." Inspector Carmichael's gaze shifted between Miss Marple and Patricia with the intensity of a man who had just realized that his investigation was approaching a critical juncture. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his tone making the name itself into a question. Patricia rose from her chair with movements that suggested she had aged significantly in the brief time since her confession to Miss Marple. "My daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "encountered Miss Crane in the hallway at approximately 2 o'clock this afternoon. They quarreled. During the course of their disagreement, Miss Crane fell. Her head struck the marble table. My husband discovered what had occurred approximately 15 minutes later. He believed that the most merciful course was to conceal the accident rather than expose my daughter to criminal investigation." The inspector's expression underwent rapid transformation from confusion to comprehension to something resembling anger. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that the entire garden party, the apparent disappearance, the staged substitute, the deception, was constructed to conceal what Mr. Ashford believed to be an accident?" "Yes," Patricia confirmed. He could not bring himself to allow Catherine to face the consequences of a moment's carelessness. He attempted to protect her through deception. "And Victor Hollis?" the inspector demanded. "What role did he play in this conspiracy?" "None," Patricia said. "He knew nothing of what had occurred. Gregory merely ensured his presence during the garden party so that his knowledge of the servants' passages would appear to be the obvious explanation for how the body had been concealed." Inspector Carmichael's jaw tightened visibly. "That," he said, his tone carrying sharp rebuke, "was a profoundly foolish decision. Mr. Hollis has spent the entire morning under suspicion of murder. He has been questioned extensively. His reputation has been damaged, all because Mr. Ashford chose to deflect suspicion rather than face facts honestly." "I know," Patricia said, and the anguish in her voice was profound and utterly genuine. "Believe me, Inspector, I have attempted to convince Gregory throughout this nightmare that concealment was not the answer. But a parent's protective instinct is powerful. It overrides judgment, reason, even basic morality." Miss Marple observed the inspector wrestling with the implications of what he had been told. The case that had appeared to be a complex murder mystery had transformed into something far more ambiguous, an accidental death, concealed through elaborate deception, with the truth now threatening to destroy not merely one family, but several lives constructed on the foundations of that original lie. "I shall require statements," the inspector said finally, "from Mr. Ashford, from Catherine Ashford, and from the housemaid. I shall also require verification from the household staff regarding the timeline. Until those statements have been taken and corroborated, I cannot determine whether this constitutes concealment of accidental death or whether there are elements of this narrative that remain obscured." As Inspector Carmichael began shepherding Patricia and the housemaid from the study, he paused at the threshold. "Miss Marple," he said, turning back to regard her with an expression that suggested grudging respect. "Your observation regarding the substitution was instrumental in unraveling this affair. I wonder how you perceived what appeared obvious to no one else." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have observed human nature for a very long time, Inspector. One learns to recognize when behavior patterns deviate from their normal configurations. A woman genuinely engaged in conversation with friends behaves differently from one who is merely maintaining an appearance of engagement. The substitute was careful and controlled. She lacked the natural spontaneity of genuine social interaction. It was that absence of authenticity that suggested something was amiss." "A valuable lesson," the inspector observed, "in the importance of attending to subtlety rather than focusing solely on obvious facts." He departed, leaving Miss Marple alone in the study. She rose slowly and made her way to the window, where she could observe the gardens of Thornfield Manor in the afternoon light. Somewhere within this beautiful house, a young woman was confronting the consequences of a moment's panic. Somewhere else, a man was recognizing that his attempt to protect his daughter had, in fact, compounded her tragedy immeasurably. And somewhere beyond the manor's walls, a man named Victor Hollis was learning that suspicion, once cast, leaves marks that no exoneration can entirely erase. The formal statements consumed the remainder of the afternoon and extended well into the evening. Inspector Carmichael conducted each interview with meticulous attention to detail, his notebook accumulating page after page of carefully recorded testimony. Miss Marple, having been released from any obligation to remain confined to the drawing room, occupied herself in the library with a book she had no particular interest in reading, though the volume provided an adequate pretext for her continued presence within the manor. It was during this period of apparent inactivity that she observed the true psychological consequences of the day's revelations manifesting themselves across the household. Gregory Ashford emerged from his interview with the inspector appearing diminished somehow, as though the act of formal confession had stripped away the protective layers of denial that had sustained him through the morning. He moved through the corridors of his own house like a man traversing unfamiliar territory, no longer commanding but merely enduring. Catherine, when Miss Marple encountered her in the hallway outside the study, appeared devastated in the manner of the young when they first confront the full weight of adult consequences. Her face was blotched from crying, her eyes holding the peculiar emptiness that comes from the collision between intention and outcome. Richard stood beside her with the posture of a man attempting to determine whether his loyalty to his fiancée extended to complicity in her family's deception. The question was written plainly across his face, and Miss Marple suspected that the answer would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. It was Patricia, however, who commanded Miss Marple's most sustained attention. The woman moved through the manor with the mechanical precision of someone operating on will alone, her emotional reserves apparently exhausted. She had made the decision to tell the truth, to allow her family's carefully constructed facade to crumble into public acknowledgement. That decision had cost her something essential, some core component of dignity that could not be easily recovered. At approximately 7 o'clock, Inspector Carmichael requested Miss Marple's presence once more in the study. This time, his expression suggested that he had reached definitive conclusions regarding the matter at hand. "I've corroborated the essential facts of Mrs. Ashford's statement," he informed her, settling into the chair behind the desk with the air of a man who had processed considerable information and arrived at understandable, if not entirely satisfying, conclusions. "The timeline is consistent. The household staff have confirmed the movement of the body through the servants' passage at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. The housemaid has admitted to the substitution and provided testimony regarding her instructions from Mr. Ashford." "And your assessment?" Miss Marple inquired. "My assessment," the inspector said heavily, "is that we are dealing with a tragedy rather than a murder in the traditional sense. The medical examination of the body indicates that death resulted from a single catastrophic blow to the back of the skull. consistent with an accidental fall onto a hard surface. There is no evidence of additional trauma or of deliberate assault. The initial contact between Catherine Ashford and Miss Crane appears to have been a quarrel conducted without physical violence until the moment of the fall. "Then you believe Catherine's account?" Miss Marple asked. "I believe it is consistent with the available evidence," the inspector replied. "However, that does not resolve the matter of the subsequent concealment. Mr. Ashford's decision to transport the body and orchestrate an elaborate deception constitutes obstruction of justice and potentially concealment of a death that should have been reported to the authorities immediately." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. When he continued, his tone had acquired a note of ambivalence that suggested he was grappling with competing obligations. "Yet I must also acknowledge," he said slowly, "that Catherine Ashford is demonstrably the victim of a terrible accident rather than the perpetrator of a crime. She did not deliberately harm Miss Crane. She panicked, which is understandable, and her father attempted to shield her from investigation, which is reprehensible but comprehensible. The question before me is whether Catherine bears criminal responsibility for an accident, or whether the responsibility lies entirely with her father for his subsequent actions. That," Miss Marple observed, "is precisely the sort of question that the law typically finds uncomfortable. The law prefers clarity and culpability. Ambiguous situations confound its mechanisms." "They do indeed," the inspector agreed grimly. "I have decided to pursue charges against Gregory Ashford for concealment and obstruction. Catherine will be questioned further, but I do not believe there is sufficient evidence to justify criminal charges against her. She was a frightened young woman who reported an accident to her father. What he subsequently chose to do falls entirely within his culpability." "A pragmatic decision," Miss Marple observed. "Though I wonder whether Mr. Ashford will view it as such. He has sacrificed his family's reputation and his own liberty in an attempt to protect his daughter. Learning that her fate has been determined independent of his sacrifice may constitute an additional form of punishment." The inspector regarded her with an expression suggesting he had not previously considered this perspective. "You possess a rather uncomfortable grasp of the ways in which good intentions can corrupt themselves into tragedy," he observed. "I have observed human nature for a very long time," Miss Marple replied. "I have learned that the greatest tragedies are rarely those that spring from malice. They are those that emerge from love twisted by fear, from protective instincts misdirected into destructive channels, from the desperate desire to shield those we love from consequences that are, in fact, inevitable regardless of our efforts to deflect them." The inspector nodded slowly, apparently absorbing this observation. "I intend to release Victor Hollis from custody immediately," he said. "The evidence against him was circumstantial at best and appears entirely exculpatory now that the true sequence of events has been established. I shall be issuing a statement clarifying his innocence in this matter." "A small grace," Miss Marple observed, "though I suspect Mr. Hollis will find that suspicion, once cast, leaves permanent marks upon one's reputation within a small community. The village will remember that he was questioned in connection with Miss Crane's death. That memory will persist regardless of his ultimate exoneration." As evening deepened into night, Miss Marple found herself alone in the drawing-room, the other guests having departed or retired to their chambers. The manor had assumed the quality of a place fundamentally altered by the day's revelations. Whatever normalcy Thornfield had possessed prior to the garden party would not be easily recovered. The house would carry the marks of this tragedy indefinitely, its beauty now complicated by the knowledge of what had occurred within its walls. She was contemplating these matters when Catherine entered, apparently seeking solitude. The young woman appeared startled to discover Miss Marple present, but made no move to leave. "I've ruined everything," Catherine said quietly, seating herself across from Miss Marple. "My engagement, my family's reputation, my father's liberty. All because I could not control my temper with that woman." "You have experienced a terrible accident," Miss Marple replied gently. "Accidents do not usually occur because we fail to control ourselves. They occur because we exist in an imperfect world where consequences are not always proportionate to our intentions. But if I had simply ignored her, if I had simply walked away, then something else would have occurred, Miss Marple interrupted. Perhaps not this day, perhaps not with Miss Crane. But human nature tends toward repetition. The patterns we establish persist until they culminate in precisely such moments as today's tragedy. Catherine looked at her with an expression of profound confusion and despair. "How," she asked, "do you endure the knowledge of human weakness? How do you live with understanding how easily good intentions corrupt into tragedy?" Miss Marple folded her hands and regarded the young woman with the compassion of someone who had witnessed 75 years of human struggle. "By recognizing," she said, "that weakness is not something to be corrected or denied, but rather acknowledged and accommodated. We are all imperfect creatures attempting to navigate an imperfect world. The best we can manage is to extend grace to one another and hope that the same grace is extended to us when our moment of weakness arrives." The following morning arrived with the sort of pale, uncertain light that typically followed significant disruptions to the natural order of things. Thornfield Manor seemed to have aged overnight, its carefully maintained facades appearing suddenly fragile and temporary. The staff moved about their duties with subdued efficiency, their conversations conducted in whispers that somehow made the silence more profound rather than less. Inspector Carmichael's departure at midday left behind a peculiar vacuum. The formal investigation had concluded, at least in its active phase. Gregory Ashford would be taken into custody by mid-afternoon, formally charged with obstruction of justice and concealment of a death. The machinery of the legal system had begun its slow, methodical process of determining punishment and consequence. Miss Marple observed that the household had divided itself into distinct psychological territories. Patricia occupied her sitting room with the demeanor of a woman who had expended all available reserves of emotional strength and had none remaining for social interaction. Catherine moved through the manor like a spectre, her engagement to Richard apparently in a state of profound uncertainty that neither party seemed entirely willing to address directly. The servants occupied themselves with their various tasks, but their attention was fragmentary, divided between their obligations and the unfolding drama that had transformed their workplace into something far more sinister than a mere country manor house. It was near 1 o'clock when Victor Hollis appeared at the manor's front entrance. He had been released from police custody that morning and had apparently spent the intervening hours wrestling with what he should do next. Now, standing in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands, he appeared to be attempting to accomplish some final business before departing Thornfield permanently. Miss Marple, observing from the library window, watched as the household manager was admitted by a servant and directed to Gregory Ashford's study. What transpired in that room remained private, but when Victor emerged approximately 20 minutes later, his expression suggested he had reached some form of resolution, though whether it was satisfactory remained questionable. It was as Victor was making his departure that Miss Marple, acting on impulse rather than deliberate calculation, intercepted him in the hallway. The man appeared momentarily startled to discover her in his path, but his expression softened when he recognized who had addressed him. "Mr. Hollis," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might spare a moment for a brief conversation." "Of course, Miss Marple," he replied with the courtesy of someone trained to respect the elderly regardless of circumstance, "though I confess I am uncertain what we might have to discuss." "Come into the library," she suggested. "There are matters I believe you should understand, matters that extend beyond the facts that Inspector Carmichael has apparently communicated to you." They settled themselves in the quiet sanctuary of the library, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge and literature that Gregory Ashford had presumably gathered without necessarily deriving much benefit from their collective wisdom. Victor sat with the posture of a man bracing himself for additional disappointments. "You must understand," Miss Marple began, "that your suspicion in this matter, though ultimately unjustified, was not entirely unreasonable from Inspector Carmichael's perspective. You possessed knowledge of the servants' passages. You had a prior romantic connection with Miss Crane, and you were observed in a state of considerable distress when her disappearance became known. These facts, assembled together, created a narrative that appeared coherent. They did indeed, Victor agreed, his voice carrying the flat quality of someone discussing matters that had lost all emotional significance. I've spent the past 12 hours attempting to determine whether I should remain in my position or tender my resignation. I've concluded that remaining would be untenable. The household staff will always harbor doubts regarding my innocence. The village will always remember the questioning. There is no path forward that does not involve departure. That may be true, Miss Marple acknowledged. Yet I believe you should understand the full context of what occurred before you make that final decision. Margaret Crane, you see, was not the woman you believed her to be. She arrived at Thornfield Manor with specific intentions regarding Gregory Ashford. She was engaged in a form of blackmail, attempting to extract payment in exchange for the concealment of information she claimed to possess. Victor's expression shifted, acquiring the quality of someone suddenly confronted with information that fundamentally altered his understanding of recent events. I did not know that, he said quietly. She told me very little about her reasons for being here. She was always somewhat evasive when I questioned her. She would have been, Miss Marple continued. What occurred yesterday was, in many respects, the inevitable culmination of the tensions that her presence created. Catherine Ashford, unaware of the full circumstances surrounding Miss Crane's visit, confronted the woman regarding her intentions toward the family. They quarreled. Miss Crane fell, and in that moment of tragedy, everything that had been carefully constructed by Mr. Ashford's protective instincts was set in motion. So she died, Victor said slowly, not because of our romantic history, but because of her own calculated manipulations. Because she attempted to exploit Gregory Ashford and encountered resistance. She died, Miss Marple corrected gently, because of an accident that occurred during a confrontation that would never have happened had she not arrived at Thornfield with intentions that extended far beyond a simple family visit. But an accident nonetheless. The cause was not malice, but mischance. Victor sat for several moments without speaking, apparently processing this information and its implications. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of something approaching peace. That is perhaps more merciful than the alternative, he said. I have spent the past hours convinced that I had been complicit in her death through my own earlier emotional entanglement with her, knowing that her fate was determined by her own choices rather than by anything I contributed. It alters the weight of responsibility I carry. Responsibility is a curious thing, Miss Marple observed. We tend to accumulate it far beyond what we actually bear. We blame ourselves for consequences that were never within our control. We assume guilt for the actions of others as though bearing witness to their choices somehow makes us complicit in them. What will you do now? She asked, shifting the conversation toward more practical matters. I've not yet determined that, Victor admitted. Mr. Ashford has, generously, offered to provide me with an excellent letter of recommendation. He has acknowledged that my innocence has been established and that my departure is not obligatory. Yet I believe the manor will always carry memories of these events. A fresh beginning elsewhere may be preferable to remaining in a place forever shadowed by this tragedy. That is a reasonable decision, Miss Marple said. Though I would encourage you to consider whether running from one's past truly resolves it or merely postpones confrontation with its emotional realities. Victor smiled, and there was in that smile a quality of genuine warmth that suggested Miss Marple's observation had resonated with something within him. You are a wise woman, Miss Marple. St. Clement's is fortunate to have you in its community, even if only temporarily. As he departed, Miss Marple reflected that wisdom and youth so rarely intersected at the moment when wisdom was most needed. Victor Hollis would likely leave Thornfield and eventually rebuild his life elsewhere. He would carry with him the marks of this tragedy, but they would gradually fade, smoothed by the passage of time and the accumulation of new experiences. The question of whether he would truly understand the lessons this event contained would likely remain unanswered. She turned back to her window, observing the gardens of Thornfield Manor in the afternoon light. Somewhere within this beautiful house, lives were being irrevocably altered. Somewhere beyond its walls, the village of St. Clement's was beginning to absorb the knowledge of what had occurred and to construct the narratives that would sustain it through the coming months and years. By the time Gregory Ashford was formally taken into custody late that afternoon, the village of St. Clement's had already begun the process of absorbing and transforming the facts of what had occurred into the narratives that would sustain community conversation for years to come. Miss Marple, observing this phenomenon with her characteristic detachment, recognized that the true resolution of any crime lay not merely in its investigation and adjudication, but in how communities chose to remember and interpret the events that had disrupted their carefully maintained normalcy. The vicar had been particularly assiduous in his efforts to frame the tragedy in terms that preserved some measure of Christian charity toward the Ashford family. His sermons, Miss Marple understood, would emphasize the perils of concealment and the redemptive possibilities of honest confrontation with one's circumstances. The village magistrate had issued carefully worded statements suggesting that the Ashfords had been, in essence, victims of Miss Crane's manipulations, which had indirectly precipitated the accident. The local newspaper's coverage had struck a balance between sensationalism and discretion, presenting the facts while attempting to preserve the family's dignity in the aftermath of their public humiliation. Catherine Ashford, released from police questioning once it became clear that her role in the tragedy was accidental rather than culpable, had withdrawn almost entirely from public life. Richard Pembroke's engagement to her remained technically unbroken, though it had acquired a tentative quality that suggested its ultimate resolution remained uncertain. Whether Richard would choose to maintain his commitment to Catherine or retreat from it remained an open question, one that only time and his own moral calculus could resolve. It was on the evening before Miss Marple's departure from Thornfield Manor that Patricia Ashford requested a final meeting with her. They sat together in the drawing room as twilight transformed the gardens into silhouettes and shadows, the space between them filled with the sort of comfortable silence that only emerges when two people have passed through shared trauma together. "I wish to thank you," Patricia said finally, "for your role in bringing this matter to its conclusion. I'm aware that you could have remained silent, could have protected Gregory by withholding the observations you made to Inspector Carmichael. Instead, you chose to pursue the truth, regardless of the consequences it might entail for this family." "I chose," Miss Marple corrected gently, "to acknowledge what I had observed. That acknowledgement led, inevitably, to the truths that Inspector Carmichael subsequently uncovered. I did not choose to harm your family. I merely chose not to participate in their concealment." "It amounts to the same thing," Patricia replied, though her tone suggested no resentment. "And perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps Gregory's attempt to shield Catherine through deception would have ultimately caused far greater damage than honest acknowledgement of what occurred." "That is a possibility," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect Mr. Ashford will never entirely accept it. He believed he was protecting his daughter. Learning that his protection has resulted in additional suffering for her may constitute a burden he carries for the remainder of his life." Patricia nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a truth she had been wrestling with throughout the day. "He has already written to Catherine, attempting to explain his actions, attempting to apologize for the consequences they have produced. She has not yet responded. I suspect it will require considerable time before Catherine can forgive her father for attempting to protect her through methods that ultimately compounded her suffering." "Forgiveness," Miss Marple observed, "is one of the most difficult and most necessary human capacities. We must forgive others for their mistakes and their failures, and we must learn to forgive ourselves for the same. Without that capacity, we would be utterly consumed by the accumulated weight of our own imperfections. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two women separated by decades of experience, yet united in their understanding of human complexity and the terrible choices that people sometimes feel compelled to make in attempts to protect those they love. When Miss Marple finally rose to retire for the evening, Patricia accompanied her to the hallway. "What will you tell the village?" Patricia asked as they reached the staircase. "When you return to St. Clement's, what narrative will you present regarding what has occurred here?" Miss Marple considered the question with deliberate care. "I will tell the truth," she said finally. "That a young woman came to Thornfield Manor with intentions that extended beyond innocent social visiting. That an accident occurred as a result of tensions her presence created. That a family, confronted with tragedy, chose to respond through concealment rather than honest acknowledgement. And that in the end, the truth emerged regardless of their efforts to suppress it. Beyond those facts, I believe the details are better left to those most directly involved." "A merciful presentation," Patricia observed, "though one that acknowledges the essential facts of what occurred." "Mercy and truth," Miss Marple said, "are not incompatible virtues. One can acknowledge what has happened while still according dignity to those who must live with the consequences of having allowed it to happen." The following morning, Miss Marple prepared for her departure from Thornfield Manor. The household staff attended to her bags and her arrangements with the careful courtesy that suggested they recognized her role in bringing clarity to the chaos that had consumed the manor over the previous 2 days. As the motor car arrived to convey her back to St. Clement's, both Patricia and Catherine appeared to bid her farewell. Catherine, though still bearing the marks of emotional devastation, managed a gracious smile and extended her hand in thanks. "I hope," she said quietly, "that you will not judge our family too harshly for what has occurred." "I judge no one," Miss Marple replied, taking the young woman's hand gently. "I merely observe. And what I have observed is that you are a young woman confronted with circumstances far beyond your control or your capacity to have anticipated. That is not judgment. That is merely the recognition of human fallibility." As the motor car carried her away from Thornfield Manor and back toward the familiar streets of St. Clement's village, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of resolution in matters of this magnitude. The case itself was concluded. Gregory Ashford would face trial and judgment. The facts had been established and recorded. Yet the true resolution, the psychological and emotional integration of what had occurred, would require years of painful work on the part of everyone involved. She understood that the village would absorb this tragedy, would incorporate it into its collective memory, and would eventually construct narratives that allowed it to move forward. In time, the scandal would fade. New dramas would emerge to capture public attention, and Thornfield Manor would gradually reclaim its position as a beautiful country house, though marked forever by the knowledge of what had transpired within its walls. Miss Marple resumed her knitting as the motor car progressed through the English countryside toward home, her needles moving with the steady rhythm that had sustained her through decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. The mystery of Margaret Crane's death had been solved, but the greater mystery of why people made the choices they did, why they attempted to conceal rather than confront, why love so often twisted itself into deception, remained as profound and as ultimately unknowable as ever. Yet that was precisely why she continued to observe, continued to listen, continued to attend to the small details of human behavior that others overlooked. For in that observation lay the possibility of understanding, and in understanding lay the possibility of compassion for the terrible, inevitable mistakes that human beings committed in their desperate attempts to protect themselves and those they loved.